This is going to be done by myself and Steve Slavutsky. I think that you guys know both of us. So I've been doing this for almost 20 years, covering Jacobs in some aspect, and all that time. I'm now the general manager of Neil Systems. And Steve Slavutsky is the regional manager for Dragger Safety. Steve's been in the industrial automation world for probably 25 years also, and about 8 doing Dragger safety design in some way. So Steve and I had gotten together I don't know, a couple months ago and just said, hey, what is something different that people really haven't talked about overall with regards to gas leak and fire detection? And we said, I think one thing that is missing is people talk about what to do, but they don't talk about what not to do and what are some of the mistakes that people make. So he and I came up with, from our 25 years plus of design and troubleshooting, what are the top 5 mistakes that we see? And so that's what we're going to try to tackle today. We're going to try to go through the ones that at least we get asked the most about. And so here's what those 5 are. So not properly designing your SOP. I know this is a big one in the pharmaceutical world, certainly. Not recognizing when to shift from kind of a basic design to a more engineered design. And certainly, with you guys being more engineering geared, that one obviously is something that's near and dear to your hearts as well. Forgetting false alarm potentials. There are so many things that once you do the installation creates false alarms that if people just did a little bit of design work up front that took some of those things into account, they may be able to not have to deal with some of those. So we'll talk through those. Not understanding some of the preventive maintenance to do. And we've certainly seen where people put a system in and they ignore it, or they don't do it right, or they'll get the cheapest way that they can to upkeep it and forget some critical things, and so the system doesn't work right. So we want to try to talk through some of that. And then last of all, the question we get asked all the time, hey, we had an event, we brought our portable in, the portable didn't agree with the fixed sensor, which one's right? So we want to try to talk through all those things today as well. So let's tackle number 1, and this is the not properly designing your SOP or your standard operating procedure. So Steve, you do a lot of work, and especially with pharmaceutical, where this is a big deal. What are some of the biggest errors you see that people miss out on when it comes to not tackling their standard operating procedure correctly in the design phase?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. A lot of times I see kind of maybe the wrong people writing the SOP. So I think in the beginning, it should be clear who the group of folks or who's the person responsible for writing that SOP. And it's a lot of times it's typically the health and safety folks at a particular company. I've seen a lot of engineering companies actually write this, but the audit for that system, for that SOP, is from the actual customer. The other thing is who audits the SOP, right? So again, it could be the end customer that's auditing it, but you need to figure out which group of people do it. Another thing that I see a lot of companies don't take advantage of is if you're already working with a gas detection company, those companies can help you, not necessarily write it, but can help you at least audit the SOP. I see that in companies that are most successful in getting the proper equipment installed properly and then used properly are the ones that get the gas detection company involved at an early stage. And we or whoever the gas detection company may be, we look forward to doing that because that gets us a closer relationship to either the engineering company or the end customer or both. And that closer relationship then gets a much broader and much more well-defined SOP. Then we need to figure out, well, okay, an alarm condition occurs. What happens? Do lights turn on? Do horns turn on? Do we want people to evacuate? Where do we want them to evacuate? Who's going to count those folks and make sure everybody's is where they need to be? Do we need to have a fire panel access as well, or we're going to call the fire department automatically? What happens if there's a false alarm? All those things kind of go into, or all those questions kind of go into in writing a really good and broad SOP so that everybody understands. A lot of the times, or a lot of the things that I just mentioned in terms of alarming, what you do if this happens, then what do you do after that? So sort of like these if-then statements. A lot of times, or most of the time, a really, really good thing to use is what's called a cause and effect chart. And so the cause and effect chart is simply just a table. It could be a spreadsheet. And on the left-hand column, as you can see on the slide now, you write down all of your inputs. On the on the horizontal or on the columns, you write all of the alarm stations or alarm activities that go on and how each one of those inputs affects that alarm activity. And you can make it as detailed as possible. So when we start off, that cause and effect chart may be just a summary, right? Just for us to figure out exactly what equipment might be required. But as we move along, you fill in a lot more things, the tag IDs. You fill in, timing information. Do you want a delay in the alarms? All those different things. How are the alarms behaving? Are they latching? Are they non-latching? Are there more than 2 alarm levels? Could there be 3 alarm levels or 4 alarm levels? All those things, cause and effect chart kind of puts all in one place, and everybody can work from that cause and effect chart. And the other thing that it helps too is if there is a controller involved, not just gas detection equipment, but also a safety controller, this helps you define how the controller is to be configured, right? So if the controller is being configured by the gas detection company that you're working with, or by on-site personnel at time of commissioning and startup, this cause and effect chart really details how that controller is supposed to be configured and how it behaves. Without it, without a cause and effect chart or a detailed document, I see way too many projects that go either overboard in pricing or in scheduling just because all these questions come up that weren't answered in the beginning of the project.
Yeah, and I would say, certainly, Steve, that the piece that I would take away from that the most is all too often we get asked at the end of a project, hey, can you help me write my SOP? And more we're trying to point people to do that like early on in the process, because if you try to wait till the end, you're going to forget something critical that someone needed or something critical that had to happen, and it can cause some costly changes for sure. And again, this is where you're hiring a good engineering company can really help you make sure that you think through some of those things.
Right, and the SOP document, once you do a first cut, it's a living and breathing document, right? So as you move more and more into the details and nitty gritty of the project, that SOP document gets updated, right? So it's a constant feedback loop on the SOP document.
Yeah, and sort of leading into that whole idea of building the SOP early. I think all too often when people need a gas leak detection system, because there have not been traditionally, if you go back, 15, 20 years ago, there weren't as many rules, definitions, standards, that sort of thing that were really put out for gas leak like there was for fire protection systems. And so
Right.
a lot of times when people needed to put these systems in, they were doing it because something had happened, something had, a leak had occurred and something had blown up, someone was exposed, they had to meet a regulation that someone, OSHA said, hey, you need to do this, that sort of thing. And so they call someone in to say, I need to put a system in to comply so that this doesn't happen again. But they aren't aware necessarily of some of the recent guidelines, standards, that sort of thing. And so if they need to put a system in, they don't really know whether they need a basic system that is just, pretty simplistic or an advanced system. There's just so much that they don't understand overall. So can you help us kind of walk through what has changed in the last 5 to 10 years as far as some of those standards and rules and regulations and that sort of thing that the gas leak and flame side is now sort of moving a little bit closer to that fire protection side as far as defining basic and advanced and what the rule sets are?
Right. So unfortunately, there's still not a standard that tells you exactly where to place the transmitters, right? There are overall standards to say, if you have a tank farm and it has an explosive gas in it, then you should mitigate that with a gas detector, right? So They might make a recommendation as to what type of gas detector, so like an LEL or a toxic or what have you. But the rules still kind of lag behind in terms of saying, well, for this type of application, excuse me, or for this size room, you need this many gas detectors, right? Because so when you look at a gas detector, think of a gas detector as your nose, right? So if you want to smell a smell, that's whatever is causing that smell has to enter your nose in order for you to detect it. The same thing with a sensor. If there's a gas cloud 20 feet away from the sensor, but it hasn't made its way to the sensor yet, the sensor is going to sit there fat, dumb, and happy and read 0 if 0 is the lowest amount to read. So what we need to make sure is when we're looking at a system, what are all the different pressures and what are all the different HVAC conditions that might happen to help us determine where those sensors need to be placed. So there are general rules of thumb that you can do. And for a small, say you're doing a lab space and it's a fairly small lab space, you want to protect the personnel that's in there. And it's fairly easy. You might have some tanks in that room. So you're going to put a detector by the tanks and you're going to put a detector by where people might congregate or sit to protect them. And you might have an alarm station outside in the vestibule so that people don't enter the area if there's an alarm. But now if you go over that, so now let's say we have a warehouse. Let's say we have a much larger lab space where we have tens of people in there and it's in square footage, it covers a large area. It becomes more difficult to figure out just by applying some rules of thumb of where to place these gas detectors. So there are some rules like NFPA 72, and ISA 84. What you'll note is a lot of folks or a lot of gas detection companies, as part of their marketing, and we do that sometimes too, is they'll say, oh, these detectors are NFPA 72 compliant. And there is no such thing, right? NFPA 72 basically tells what types of equipment might be used in certain situations. So what do you do if this type of alarm happens versus that type of alarm? There's nothing in the standard that says you shall use detector XYZ and put it in this location. So NFPA 72 at the end of it has to be approved by the authority having jurisdiction. And that authority having jurisdiction could be a fire marshal, or in a larger company, it could be someone within the company that has that jurisdiction. So NFPA 72 is not a standard. It just, you have to meet certain rules and regulations from the authority having jurisdiction. So a gas detector saying I'm NFPA 72 compliant really doesn't mean anything, because they might be compliant in one jurisdiction and another jurisdiction says no, that we can't use it. So it just all depends. The biggest change has been in what's called ISA 84, and that is a really, really good standard to read through overall and understand. And it goes through things like, types of gas detection technologies. What kinds of control actions would you want to take based upon certain conditions occurring? How many people might be in a space? All of that is taken into account. And so following up on that, some engineering companies, as well as gas detection companies, can use three-dimensional software. Ours is called Hazmat 3D, where we can input a specific standard like an ISA 84, or we can use a standard that's been developed, say, by someone like a Chevron or someone like an ExxonMobil, where they have internal standards of what the coverage might need to be. So we apply those standards in this software, come up with a three-dimensional view of the customers or of the end users' topology or of their actual plant, and say, well, if we place these transmitters here, here, and here, this is how much coverage you have, based upon these standards, based upon the ISA 84, or based upon your own internal standard. And then we work back and forth with them to say, well, is this enough coverage? Is it okay that you have 50% coverage here, but you have no coverage in this space? And we might want to say, well, depending on how the HVAC air currents are going around, we're less likely to have a gas cloud going in this direction versus that direction. So we're going to put more detection here and less over there. And what a lot of people mistakenly think, I think, is that gas detection companies try to throw these gas mapping software around just so we can increase the quantities of the transmitters that we're supplying. And that's really not the reason why we do this. The reason why we do this is that so you have the exact amount of detectors or transmitters that you need for the coverage that's specified in the customer's internal rules and regulations. Most of the time, I would say about 70 to 75% of the time, I found that when we do these studies on a project that's maybe already been completed and they just want to know if they have enough coverage, we find that they're using too many transmitters than we would have recommended for the specifications that they would provide. And so spending a little bit of time and money on this type of software really gives you a lot of advantages in determining the exact quantity of transmitters that are needed and where they need to be placed. And at the end of it, you get an engineering document that's about 60 pages long that details exactly why the types of transmitters they used and why they were put in the places that they were put in. So if there's ever any kind of government agency or internal health and safety folks asking the project manager, well, why are you putting these detectors where you put them? You now have a document that tells them exactly why.
Yeah, and I know, Steve, a lot of the engineering companies that we work with that also provide a similar service, they can access this software as well if they want to use it for their customers. So that is a useful tool.
Yeah, they can certainly license the software. That's not a problem. We can work with them to develop these documents. It's in kind of any which way we want to slice it out. That's perfectly fine. Yep.
Yep. All right, so let's jump up to the next one. So, I mean, the worst thing that happens is you put one of these systems in, and then you get the call in a couple of months where they said, "Hey, the operator shut down the alarm system because it was in their mind putting out false alarms, or the flame detector's going off. I can't find any proof that it should be, so I'm shutting it off or disconnecting it." So false alarms are like the bane of our existence for these sorts of things because they really desensitize people to something when it really could occur. So, from a Draeger design standpoint, when you guys are doing designs for flame detectors or for gas leak detectors or what have you, what are some of the major key things that you really try to get customers to remember that they need to do in the design phase?
Yeah, one of probably the most important thing is to know the process, right? To know what the different gases or vapors that might happen during the production process or during when the process is running. That is the biggest thing, is that a lot of customers don't realize they might have some reactions in the process that will off gas some gas that we didn't think about that could be a cross sensitivity for the actual sensor that they're using. So I'll give you an example. Something like a carbon monoxide sensor is very, very sensitive to hydrogen, right? So if you're working on a system and there could be hydrogen around and you don't actually let us know that in the beginning, and you start using that carbon monoxide sensor, it could react to hydrogen, right? It's a really significant cross sensitivity to hydrogen. So there are mitigation steps that we can make so that we're not as sensitive to hydrogen by using a correct sensor. But those things really, really matter. We put out an extensive list of cross-sensitive gases, whether it's for electrochemical sensors, catalytic bead, IR sensors, what have you. There's a pretty exhaustive list of cross-sensitivities that whoever is designing the system should be looking at and saying, do we have any of those cross-sensitive gases in there? And if we do, how is the sensor going to be affected? Or two, no, I don't see any of the gases that we might have as being cross-sensitive gases to the sensor. That doesn't mean we're not cross-sensitive to that gas. It just means it hasn't been tested yet. So if you come back and tell us to say, I have these gases present, how will the sensor react to these gases? We can then go back to our engineering group and basically have them do a quick study and say, well, this shouldn't affect it, or yes, this will affect it, and here's by how much. So that is probably the most critical thing to understand in order to mitigate quote unquote false alarms. A lot of times also folks think that they are having a false alarm when they really are having an alarm. They just can't find the actual leak. So you do have to take it really, really seriously if you get any sort of readings on the sensor. The other thing to understand is, what are the environmental conditions, right? What is the humidity range that could be present? What is the temperature range that the sensor might be sitting in? Is the sensor going to be sitting in an area where the humidity is over 95% relative humidity? And if so, what do we do then? So all those things need to go in to not only selecting the proper sensor, but also knowing what might cause an alarm and what things to look for if an alarm does occur. For flame sensing technologies, a lot of times, the UV, the UVIR, the triple IR, the multi-IR, all those types of detectors have advantages and disadvantages depending on what you're doing. So for instance, if you're outdoors, you might not want to use just a UV flame detector, right? If there's sun shining right on the unit, you might even not even want to use a triple IR. Maybe you want to use a video-based flame detector, right? It's looking at the actual behavior of the flame in the video. So it's not using any of the UVI, triple IR standard type of flame detection. It's actually looking at the behavior of the visible flame to determine if there is a flame. Or maybe you're detecting hydrogen. Well, you can't use a video-based flame detector for hydrogen because that is non-visible. So all those things go into account as to what type of detector, what type of transmitter is being used. And if you work closely with the gas detection company, we will be able to help you out in determining that. But we need a list of all the different types of gases and vapors that could be present. So a lot of times our folks or our customers will see sensors that go negative. And a lot of times it's because of the way they've been calibrated. So if they calibrate with a very dry gas, but the ambient humidity levels are much larger, then you can see the sensor drifting negative because of the humidity. So there's different ways of mitigating that. But if we don't know that up front, then you might run into all these different issues that make it look like, oh, the sensor's not working, when it really is. And the slide that you have up right now, Shane, really talks to all of the different things or all the different specifications that go into determining what is the accuracy of the sensor, right? So we have customers asking us, well, what's the accuracy of your sensor? Well, it's a loaded question, because look at all the different things that go into the sensor being or the sensor reading correctly, right? So drift, aging, pressure, flow, temperature, all those different things determine what the accuracy of the sensor is. So it's very difficult to say this sensor is plus or minus X%. It all depends on what the environmental conditions are.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks, Steve. All right. Mistake number 4. This one is certainly one that I saw probably about 8 to 10 years ago. I was an industrial gas customer, and they said to us that they test their system, and it was 150 plus sensors, plus all the lights and horns and controllers, et cetera. We test our system once a week with full bump testing on every single sensor. And as we started to drill down as to why they did this, they couldn't really say other than, well, it was the corporate policy, and we have to do this.
Right.
And yet they were complaining bitterly about all the time that they needed to do it. And so as we dug deeper and deeper, we found that the other manufacturer's sensor that they had been using would just fall asleep. And there was no notice, there was no warning. Nothing happened at the sensor level to warn that this was going to happen. And because they'd had this happen a few times and corporate was so scared about it, they forced them to bump test once a week every single one of the units in the system. And so it really came down to, from a preventative maintenance standpoint, that was all that they knew to do. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. We were able to help them out, really, walking through that they could really do the same thing probably once a year and get by using a Draeger solution. But the flip
Right.
side of that is that you put in a high end system like a Draeger solution, and then you don't do anything to it. You just put it on the wall and you forget about it, and you just assume it's going to keep going. I mean, we see all ends of the spectrum there. So from a Draeger standpoint, when you guys provide a system to somebody, what are the suggestions that you really feel are important for both the design people and the maintenance people, the operational people, to keep that running at an optimal level? What do you recommend?
Right. So the first thing is for everyone to understand that no matter what type of sensor you're using, the sensors need ongoing maintenance, whether it's in the form of bump testing the sensor or calibrating the sensor. No matter what type of sensor it is or how long it might last, there's always going to be ongoing maintenance in the form of calibration. The question is, how often do you do it, right? And that's probably the biggest question that we get. As soon as we start talking about our sensor, one of the first questions is, how often do I need to calibrate? Which is great that end users and engineering companies know the sensors need to be calibrated. But a lot of times, customers either do less calibration than what's really necessary, or they do way more calibration than what's really necessary. So you have to really understand how a sensor operates, or ways in finding out, how do I know when to really calibrate the sensor? And so if you look at our data sheets, we are always publishing what's called a long-term drift spec. And so whoever sensor you might be using, they should have that same standard or same spec. And based upon that long-term drift, you can say, well, in 3 months or in 4 months or in 5 months, I'm going to be 5 to 10 ppm off of my measurement. And is that okay? If you're measuring a 0 to 1,000 ppm of whatever gas, and you're going to be 5 ppm off on your measurement, you're probably going to be okay. 5 ppm isn't going to be that much of a difference in a 1,000 ppm range sensor. And if that's the case, then by the time it gets to that drift, and whatever that time is, then you don't need to calibrate, right? So in 5 months, if you're plus or minus 5 ppm off, you don't need to necessarily calibrate if you're willing to live with that error, with that 5 ppm error. If you're not, then it's time to calibrate. The same thing can be done if you're doing a bump test. So let's, for instance, say you get the sensor, it's installed, and let's say once a month or once every 3 months, you perform a bump test. So this is not a calibration. You're just putting the gas on the sensor and seeing what the final value is of the sensor that it gets to. Does it match what it says on the cylinder that you're using? And if you're plus or minus a couple of ppm off, if you're okay there, you don't need to calibrate. So you just keep going and going and going until the point at which the end customer, the health and safety folks, whoever, are not comfortable with that error anymore. That's when you calibrate. And that's it. So some companies, no matter what, calibrate every 3 months. Some companies, no matter what, calibrate every 6 months. And some companies do a little bit of both, right? They look at the sensor, they make sure what the long-term drift might be, and then they calibrate based on that. So it's really, really important to understand the actual specifications of the sensor. So we, as a gas detection company, have absolutely no recommendation on the calibration of the sensor. What we say, if you're getting our, say, smart transmitters, by default, there's a calibration period of 6 months. That's only just the default state. That doesn't mean that we recommend calibrating every 6 months. Each and every sensor is going to be different. The environment's going to be different. You might have the same exact sensor in 2 different environments. One needs to be calibrated every 3 months. One doesn't need to be calibrated for other than once a year. So it just depends on the environment. The other thing is, too, how are you calibrating the sensors? Are you using fresh air to calibrate 0, let's say, or are you using a really dry nitrogen or really dry 0 air gas cylinder? Because what happens is the calibration gases are extremely dry. You take them off after you calibrate it, all that humidity rushes in, it could cause an error in the sensor. So the best recommendation is when you're calibrating to use ambient air for 0, and there's a thing called a Nafion tube, where let some humidity into the tube to kind of mimic the environmental conditions. So all of that kind of goes into knowing what you have and knowing how to calibrate properly. And the way that you do that is by getting training through Draeger, whether it's in Houston at our office or have our service guys do some training at commissioning and startup, or have someone like me coming in again at commissioning and startup and go through the entire system with the end user. And that has to happen periodically, right? So if somebody's working on our equipment, they're calibrating every 6 months, they might be more familiar with our equipment. But if someone's calibrating, say, once a year, they may not be. So ongoing training as to how the equipment works goes a really, really long way for having equipment that is working the right way and is not drifting so much and is not giving you so many false alarms. But yeah, all those things kind of go into having a good piece of equipment or a good system.
And I would go as far, Steve, as to say that, even in the spec writing or the bid process or whatever's being designed, it's probably not a good idea. It probably is a good idea that you put something in there, even to say, that factory authorized training should be provided as part of the package, just to make sure that whoever's going to be handling things, whether it's a regular authorized person or not, that they really know what needs to be done. Because especially if they don't know what needs to be done, they can definitely miss critical things that will be highly impactful. So.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Number 5, this is our final one. So, this one really hit home about a year and a half ago, where we had a customer that called us up, and they didn't have a Dregger system at the time, but they said, hey, we have this a fixed system that was installed. We had an event that occurred, and our people who are our safety team, they got their portables out, and the portables were reading off the charts. The local fire department got called. Their portables were reading off the charts, and they shut the entire facility down, chained the doors. I mean, it was a huge deal. Cost the company millions of dollars, and in the end, the major problem was that there was a gas present that the sensors had reacted to that wasn't really a cause of concern for the gas that was important. But because they didn't fundamentally understand how fixed sensors works and how portable sensors work, it really was a costly disaster for them that caused no one any actual risk of danger at all, but did cost them a lot of money overall. So we see this all too often, where we put fixed systems in, and the SOP says if there's an event that occurs, either the first responder or the environmental health and safety folks bring their portables out. And all too often we get the call, these two things don't agree. Who's right? So can you walk us through a little bit of that and help us make some sense over it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer to the question of who's right is both of them are right. Or if one is showing and the other one is not, you still have some sort of an issue. So the thing to keep in mind is a portable sensor, and if we're talking about just electrochemical sensors for now, a portable sensor is a much smaller sensor than what a fixed gas sensor is. They may have a little bit of a different chemistry to them. Because of that, portable sensors are meant to be used, say, on a shift, maybe 8 hours a day, and then brought back to fresh air. They're meant to be bump tested at least every time a person comes and grabs them and takes them. They need to be bump tested. They're calibrated a little bit more often than most fixed gas detection sensors. Their cross sensitivities are going to be somewhat different. Some cross sensitivity of a specific gas may have a positive offset for a fixed gas detection sensor, and may have a negative offset for a portable gas detection system, or the other way around. So you really have to know what all the different cross sensitivities are. The other thing that's important too is how do you calibrate the fixed gas detector versus the portable. So the problem that you described, a lot of times, when somebody's asking, well, my portable's not reading something, but my fixed is, or vice versa. The problem is, how do you actually calibrate the two sensors? And it mostly comes up with reactive gases. So ammonia, chlorine, hydrogen sulfide, sulfur dioxide. Those types of gases are the ones that give the most amount of trouble. And the reason for that is, most of the time, it's the calibration equipment, okay? So are you using a stainless steel regulator to calibrate both sensors? Are you using the same exact gas to calibrate both sensors? If they're different gases, what is the error for each individual gas bottle that you're using? Is there is the tubing correct? Are you using Teflon tubing? Are you using Viton tubing? And is Viton tubing okay? Because if you're using Viton tubing for one and you're using, say, Tygon tubing for the other, that gas might react with the tubing or the calibration equipment that you're using, and not as much gas is getting to the sensor. And so if not as much gas is getting to the sensor and you calibrate at that point, the gain of that sensor really goes high, right? So we're much more sensitive now than we would otherwise be. So if you calibrated your portable correctly, but you're not calibrating your fixed gas detector correctly, the fixed gas detector will react a lot faster and a lot more because its gain has been turned up. Whereas the portable, it's not, it's normal, let's say. And vice versa, it goes the other way around too. So you have to really, really understand and make sure the type of calibration equipment that you're using. Another example, for portable gas detector, you could do a zero calibration in fresh air, right? You take it outside and you do your zero in fresh air. Where for a fixed gas detector, you typically don't do that. You can't take it outside because it's connected to a wall or connected to some sort of a structure. So you can't do that. So you're typically calibrating with a really dry gas, whether it's nitrogen or whether it's zero air at 20.9% by volume of oxygen. It's still really, really dry. So if the if the ambient conditions are really humid, you take that calibration off, all that humidity rushes in. Depending on the type of sensor that you're using, it could have a negative effect or you could have a positive effect in it. So all those things have to be understood in order to say, okay, one really is mismatching from the other. And if all the calibrations have been done correctly, all the correct equipment has been done, all the correct calibration gas has been used, then the issue might be is your fixed gas detector is calibrating with way too much dry air. We might want to introduce some humidity into the sample, or B, there's a cross sensitivity difference, right? So the portable sensor is not as cross sensitive to this whatever other gas is present, or vice versa, than the fixed gas detection system. So all those things go into it. I would say the number one thing people don't realize is the calibration between the two types of sensors. The other thing is too, are you using the same manufacturer's portable and fixed? If you're using another manufacturer's portable and another manufacturer's fixed, then all those things are even multiplied even more, right? Because the electrochemistry of the sensor now could be completely different. You can have completely different cross-sensitive lists from that. So all those things have to be understood. But to go back to your first question of which one is right, which one is wrong, they're both right? So you have to understand the differences between the two sensors to say, well, one is showing something, there must be something there. I need to investigate of what could be happening. And it could be a cross-sensitive gas, or it could be that you're not calibrating the sensor as it should be calibrated.
Well, thank you. And that, I have to say, there's a lot that you just shared on that last one. And the biggest thing that I could take away from that would be certainly in the design phase, a discussion should be had as part of the SOP of who's going to be responding, what equipment they're going to be responding with, and just making sure that there is a discussion to make sure that those pieces, it's understood with the people that are going to be responding, that they know what's happening in that application, they know what some of the challenges are, rather than just waiting until it finally happens. And that, that just takes some good engineering planning, I think, overall. So,
Yep.
Okay, so what I wanted to just offer up last here is that whether you're watching this video after the fact or present here, Steve and I put together a list of questions that as you're doing your design of your system, that you can ask yourself or ask in the process of design with your engineering company or what have you. And it's located at this website here. So this is on our website. It's a landing page, and it specifically gives a list of questions for each one of these 5 mistakes that you can go to. You can check it out and download, and just use this as part of your question asking as you're designing everything overall. So just kind of finishing everything off, here's where our 5 were. And so, we talked about the SOP. We talked about knowing when to transition from a basic to an advanced, and what some of the standards are that exist. Knowing false alarms and trying to design for them rather than after the fact. Making sure that you get the right training and right preventative maintenance being done, and also trying to decide ahead of time how the portables and the fixed are going to talk, and what they're going to do differently, and that sort of stuff. So I think all really, really important things. If you could knock these things out, you will have dealt with a lot of the issues after the fact that we come in and have to deal with after design has already been done.